Welcome to Crime Bedtime, your go-to channel for chilling, true crime bedtime stories. So snuggle up, close your eyes, and let the stories unfold. Today we will be talking about the Night Stalker. Richard Ramirez, born Ricardo Leva Munoz Ramirez on February 29, 1960, in El Paso, Texas, was the youngest of Julian and Mercedes Ramirez's 5 children. His early life was filled with troubling events and influences that shaped his dark future. Growing up in a working-class Mexican-American family, Richard's childhood was marred by instability and exposure to violence. Julian Ramirez, Richard's father, was a former Juarez, Mexico policeman who worked on the Santa Fe Railroad. Known for his volatile temper, Julian often unleashed his frustrations through physical and verbal abuse, creating a tense and fear-filled household. Mercedes, Richard's mother, worked in a boot factory, and her exposure to toxic chemicals during pregnancy has been speculated to contribute to Richard's later health issues and possible neurological damage. Julian's harsh discipline extended to all his children, but Richard, being the youngest, seemed to bear the brunt of his father's wrath. His siblings tried to shield him when they could, but the pervasive fear and instability left a lasting impact on Richard's psyche. The Ramirez household was marked by frequent violent outbursts and periods of uneasy calm, creating a volatile environment that left Richard with deep emotional scars. A critical and deeply disturbing influence in Richard's early life was his cousin, Miguel "Mike" Ramirez. Mike was a decorated Green Beret combat veteran who had served in the Vietnam War. Upon returning from Vietnam, Mike lived with the Ramirez family for a period. Richard, who was then only 12 years old, formed a close bond with Mike, who regaled him with grisly stories of his wartime experiences. These were not ordinary war stories. Mike spoke of atrocities, including torture, mutilation, and the killing of Vietnamese women, often accompanied by photographic evidence of these horrific acts. Richard was both fascinated and disturbed by these stories, which planted the seeds for his future obsessions with violence and death. Mike's stories were often accompanied by gruesome photographs and trophies from his time in Vietnam. He would describe in graphic detail the methods of torture and the sheer joy he found in inflicting pain, which fascinated young Richard. Mike also showed Richard various weapons he had brought back from the war, teaching him how to handle and use them. These interactions instilled in Richard a morbid curiosity and a desensitization to violence. This exposure to graphic violence at such a formative age had a profound effect on Richard. Mike, far from a benign influence, actively encouraged Richard's burgeoning fascination with brutality. He taught Richard military skills, including how to kill stealthily. This dark mentorship reached a chilling climax when Richard witnessed Mike shoot and kill his wife, Jessie, during a domestic argument in 1973. Witnessing a trusted family member commit cold-blooded murder profoundly impacted Richard's psyche, blurring the lines between life and death and normalcy and violence. In the wake of witnessing such a traumatic event, Richard became withdrawn and sullen, distancing himself from his family and school. His teenage years were marked by a descent into delinquency, heavily influenced by his early exposure to violence and Mike's guidance. During his high school years, Richard turned to drug use, starting with marijuana and eventually progressing to harder substances such as LSD and cocaine. Substance abuse offered Richard an escape from his chaotic home life and the haunting memories of violence. They also played a significant role in the development of his increasingly erratic and antisocial behavior. Richard's petty crimes began with shoplifting and vandalism. As he grew bolder, he graduated to breaking into homes and cars, often stealing items of little value but significant personal importance to the victims. His use of drugs escalated alongside his criminal activities, with LSD and cocaine becoming his drugs of choice. These substances not only offered an escape from his reality but also fueled his violent fantasies and contributed to his erratic behavior. Richard's friends and acquaintances noted his increasing paranoia and obsession with dark rituals, often finding him in a drug-induced haze muttering about Satan and power. Richard's foray into petty crime began with theft and burglary. He dropped out of high school and spent more time on the streets, honing his skills as a burglar. His crimes became more frequent and audacious, and he developed a reputation among his peers for his willingness to take risks and his fascination with the macabre. He frequently indulged in satanic rituals and became obsessed with the occult, often using symbols and paraphernalia associated with Satanism during his burglaries. Influenced by local gang members and street criminals, Richard's life of crime became further normalized, reinforcing his belief in achieving power through fear and violence. These figures provided a perverse form of mentorship, reinforcing Richard's belief that power and respect could be achieved through fear and brutality. Richard's adolescence was also marked by frequent run-ins with the law, but these early criminal activities were often dismissed as juvenile delinquency. Unfortunately, the lack of serious consequences only emboldened him, fostering a sense of invincibility and reinforcing his belief that he could operate outside the bounds of societal norms. By the time Richard Ramirez left El Paso for the bright lights of Los Angeles in his early 20s, he was already a seasoned criminal with a deeply entrenched penchant for violence, drugs, and the occult. These factors, traumatic childhood, exposure to extreme violence, substance abuse, and negative influences, culminated in Richard's evolution into the Night Stalker, one of America's most notorious serial killers. Richard Ramirez's transition from a petty criminal to the infamous Night Stalker began in earnest in 1984 when he moved to Los Angeles. Initially, his criminal activities mirrored the burglaries he had committed in El Paso, but they soon escalated into a series of violent and gruesome attacks that terrorized the city. The first known attack attributed to Ramirez occurred on June 28, 1984. His victim was Jenny Vincow, a 79-year-old widow who lived alone in her apartment in Glassell Park, a neighborhood in northeast Los Angeles. Ramirez broke into her home through an open window. Once inside, he sexually assaulted her before stabbing her repeatedly, nearly decapitating her. The sheer brutality of this crime marked a significant escalation from his previous criminal activities and set the tone for the horrors to come. Over the following months, Ramirez continued to commit burglaries, but the nature of his attacks became increasingly violent. On March 17, 1985, he struck again, this time targeting Maria Hernandez and her roommate Dale Okazaki in their home in Rosemead, a suburb of Los Angeles. Hernandez managed to survive after shielding herself with her hands, which deflected the bullet intended for her head. Okazaki, however, was not as fortunate. She was shot and killed. That same night, Ramirez also shot and killed 30-year-old Ty Lee and Veronica Yu in Monterey Park. These early attacks demonstrated Ramirez's growing confidence and his willingness to engage in increasingly violent behavior. He quickly gained a reputation for his unpredictability and the sheer terror he inflicted on his victims. His crimes were not limited to any specific demographic or area, making it difficult for law enforcement to predict where he would strike next. On March 27, 1985, Ramirez entered the home of Vincent Zazara, age 64, and his wife Maxine, age 44, in Whittier, California. After shooting Vincent in his sleep, Ramirez brutally assaulted Maxine, who had attempted to fight back. In a particularly gruesome act, Ramirez mutilated her body, gouging out her eyes and placing them in a jewelry box, which he took with him. The brutality of this crime sent shockwaves through the community and intensified the media frenzy around the mysterious Night Stalker. As spring turned to summer, the attacks continued. On May 14, 1985, Ramirez broke into the home of Bill Doi, 66, and his disabled wife Lillian in Monterey Park. After shooting Bill in the face and beating him unconscious, Ramirez bound and assaulted Lillian, forcing her to reveal where their valuables were kept. Despite her compliance, Lillian was sexually assaulted and left traumatized. Bill succumbed to his injuries and died at the scene. This attack further underscored Ramirez's escalating violence and complete disregard for human life. In June 1985, Ramirez struck again, targeting a couple, Carol Kyle, 42, and her 11-year-old son in their home in Arcadia. After binding and sexually assaulting Carol, Ramirez forced her to perform demeaning acts while her son was restrained in another room. He repeatedly threatened to kill both of them if they did not comply. Miraculously, they survived the ordeal, but the psychological scars were profound. Richard Ramirez's methods of operation were as varied as they were terrifying. His preference for attacking at night earned him the moniker the Night Stalker, and his nocturnal invasions added an extra layer of fear to the communities he targeted. Ramirez favored the cover of darkness, often breaking into homes in the dead of night when his victims were most vulnerable. This nocturnal predation not only facilitated his entry into homes, but also maximized the fear and psychological torment experienced by his victims. The randomness of his attacks meant that no one felt safe, regardless of neighborhood or security measures. Ramirez often spent days scouting neighborhoods, identifying potential targets by their routines and the vulnerability of their homes. He was known to disable lights, cut phone lines, and use tools to silently break into homes. Survivors of his attacks recounted the terrifying moments when they realized an intruder was in their home, often waking up to Ramirez's sinister presence in their bedroom. The psychological scars left on these survivors were profound, with many suffering from PTSD, nightmares, and an inability to feel safe in their own homes. The randomness of his attacks made every home in the area a potential target, spreading fear and anxiety throughout the community. Ramirez was known for his versatility and brutality in choosing weapons. He used guns, knives, machetes, tire irons, and hammers, often bringing these tools with him to the crime scenes. This unpredictability in weapon choice made it challenging for investigators to establish a clear pattern initially. His use of different weapons also indicated a desire to inflict maximum fear and pain. Ramirez targeted homes with seemingly little regard for the type of neighborhood or the socioeconomic status of his victims. He often chose homes that appeared easily accessible, such as those with open windows or doors, and he showed a keen ability to bypass security measures. Once inside, he would quickly incapacitate the occupants before committing his heinous acts. He exhibited a chilling familiarity with suburban layouts, indicating meticulous planning and reconnaissance. Ramirez's crimes frequently involved sexual assault, followed by murder. He showed no mercy, often killing his victims after assaulting them to eliminate witnesses. His methods of murder were particularly brutal, involving multiple stab wounds, gunshots, or bludgeoning. This escalation from burglary to sexual assault and murder highlighted a deepening sadistic drive. A notable and chilling aspect of Ramirez's modus operandi was his penchant for leaving satanic symbols at the crime scenes. He would draw pentagrams and other occult symbols on the walls or on his victims' bodies, sometimes using lipstick or the victim's own blood. Ramirez also verbally declared his allegiance to Satan during his attacks, which added a terrifyingly ritualistic element to his crimes. These acts were intended to instill additional fear and confusion, creating a sense of omnipotence and chaos. Ramirez derived pleasure from instilling fear, often taunting his victims before killing them. He demonstrated a level of psychological cruelty that amplified the horror of his physical violence. Survivors recounted how he would often play mind games, prolonging their agony before delivering the fatal blow. This psychological component of his attacks was as devastating as the physical violence, leaving lasting trauma on survivors. One of the most unsettling aspects of Ramirez's crimes was his unpredictability. He did not adhere to a consistent victim profile or method of attack, making it nearly impossible for law enforcement to anticipate his next move. His victims ranged from young children to elderly adults, spanning various ethnicities and backgrounds. This randomness not only hindered police efforts but also amplified the public's fear, as anyone could be a potential target. By the summer of 1985, the media had fully embraced the Night Stalker moniker, and public fear reached a fever pitch. Ramirez's ability to evade capture, despite an intensified police effort, only added to his mystique and the terror he inspired. His reign of terror left a profound impact on the communities of Southern California. The randomness and brutality of his attacks created an atmosphere of fear and paranoia. People felt unsafe in their own homes, and the Night Stalker became a symbol of terror that haunted the public consciousness. The combination of his unpredictable methods, the satanic elements, and the sheer violence of his crimes set Ramirez apart as one of the most feared and reviled serial killers in American history. Richard Ramirez's crime spree between 1984 and 1985 left a lasting scar on the communities of Southern California. His attacks were marked by extreme brutality, randomness in victim selection, and a chilling unpredictability that kept the entire region on edge. One of the most infamous murders committed by Ramirez was that of Maxine and Vincent Zazara in their Whittier, California home. Ramirez broke into their house late at night. He shot Vincent, 64, while he slept, killing him instantly. Maxine, 44, was awakened by the gunshot and attempted to fight back, retrieving a shotgun from under the bed, which unfortunately was not loaded. Ramirez shot her 3 times before brutally mutilating her body post-mortem. He gouged out her eyes and placed them in a jewelry box, which he took with him. The sheer savagery of this crime, especially the mutilation of Maxine's body, shocked the community and highlighted Ramirez's escalating brutality. Another horrific crime occurred when Ramirez broke into the home of Bill Doy, 66, and his disabled wife, Lillian, in Monterey Park. After shooting Bill in the face and leaving him for dead, Ramirez brutally assaulted and raped Lillian, 56. He ransacked the house, taking valuables before fleeing the scene. Bill managed to crawl to the phone and call 911 but succumbed to his injuries before help arrived. Lillian survived but was left traumatized. This attack emphasized Ramirez's complete disregard for human life and his capacity for extreme violence. In Monrovia, California, Ramirez targeted 2 elderly sisters, Mabel Marbell, 83, and Florence Nettie Lang, 81. He broke into their home, bludgeoned them with a hammer, and then used an electrical cord to shock them. Ramirez drew a pentagram on Marbell's thigh and on the walls of their home with lipstick. Both women were found alive but comatose. Marbell later died from her injuries, while Nettie Lang survived but suffered permanent damage. This attack showcased Ramirez's sadistic tendencies and his obsession with satanic symbolism. The following night, Ramirez entered the Burbank home of Carol Kyle, 42, and her 11-year-old son. He bound Carol and sexually assaulted her repeatedly while threatening her son's life. Ramirez forced her to swear on Satan that she would not scream during the assault. He then ransacked the house, took valuables, and fled. Both Carol and her son survived, but the psychological trauma was immense. The randomness and brutality of this attack further instilled fear in the community. In Glendale, California, Ramirez attacked Layla Needing, 66, and her husband Maxon, 68. He shot Maxon in the head and then beat and sexually assaulted Layla. Ramirez used lipstick to draw a pentagram on Layla's body and on the walls of their home. The couple was found alive but severely injured. This attack, like many others, involved satanic elements and extreme violence, heightening the community's terror. In the Lake Merced area of San Francisco, Ramirez entered the home of Peter Pan, 66, and his wife Barbara, 62. He shot Peter in the head, killing him instantly. He then beat and sexually assaulted Barbara before shooting her in the head. After killing Barbara, Ramirez used lipstick to draw a pentagram and the phrase "Jack the Knife" on the wall. This attack not only showcased his brutality but also his desire to leave a lasting impression of fear and chaos. Analyzing Richard Ramirez's psychological state provides insight into the motivations and reasons behind his sadistic behavior. Several criminologists and psychologists have studied Ramirez's case, attempting to understand the complex interplay of factors that led to his horrific crimes. Experts believe Ramirez exhibited signs of sadistic personality disorder, characterized by deriving pleasure from inflicting pain, suffering, and humiliation on others. His attacks were not just about killing but also about dominating and controlling his victims, which he achieved through extreme violence and psychological terror. Ramirez's exposure to violence at a young age, particularly through his cousin Miguel, played a significant role in shaping his psyche. Witnessing his cousin commit a brutal murder and being shown graphic images of violence likely desensitized him to human suffering and normalized brutality. Ramirez's heavy use of drugs, including cocaine and LSD, may have exacerbated his violent tendencies. Substance abuse can impair judgment, reduce inhibitions, and increase aggression, contributing to the escalation of his criminal activities. Ramirez's interest in Satanism and the occult was more than superficial. It was a core part of his identity and his modus operandi. By incorporating satanic symbols and rituals into his crimes, Ramirez not only expressed his beliefs but also aimed to instill fear and confusion in his victims and the broader community. This fascination with Satanism may have provided a framework for justifying his actions and distancing himself from societal norms. Ramirez demonstrated a profound lack of empathy and remorse, traits often associated with psychopathy. He viewed his victims as objects to be used for his gratification rather than as human beings with inherent worth. This dehumanization allowed him to commit his crimes without guilt or regret. Dr. Helen Morrison, forensic psychiatrist. Dr. Morrison, who interviewed Ramirez, suggested that his behavior was a result of deep-seated psychological issues stemming from his traumatic childhood. She noted his inability to form genuine emotional connections and his need to exert power and control over others. Dr. Michael H. Stone, psychiatrist and professor of clinical psychiatry. Dr. Stone categorized Ramirez as a power-control serial killer, driven by a need to dominate and inflict suffering. He emphasized Ramirez's sadistic tendencies and his pleasure in the pain of others. Ramirez's crime spree had a profound psychological impact on the communities he targeted. The randomness and brutality of his attacks created an atmosphere of pervasive fear. Residents felt unsafe in their own homes, leading to increased security measures, community watch programs, and widespread anxiety. The satanic elements of his crimes added an additional layer of horror, as people grappled with the notion that such evil could exist in their midst. In conclusion, Richard Ramirez's crime spree was marked by extreme brutality, randomness, and a deep-seated sadism. His psychological profile reveals a complex interplay of childhood trauma, substance abuse, and a fascination with Satanism, all contributing to his horrific behavior. The fear and chaos he inflicted on Southern California left an indelible mark on the communities he terrorized, making him one of the most notorious serial killers in American history. Criminologists like Dr. Eric Hickey noted that Ramirez's childhood experiences of abuse and exposure to violence likely contributed to his development as a serial killer. Dr. Hickey explained that the combination of a violent role model in Mike and the lack of positive guidance created a perfect storm for Ramirez's criminal tendencies. Forensic psychologist Dr. Catherine Ramsland added that Ramirez's heavy drug use further eroded any moral constraints he might have had, allowing his sadistic impulses to flourish unchecked. The investigation into Richard Ramirez's crime spree, later identified as the Night Stalker case, was one of the most challenging and complex undertakings in the history of California law enforcement. The sheer randomness and brutality of Ramirez's attacks created significant obstacles for the police, who struggled to find connections between the crimes and identify a suspect. Ramirez's crimes spanned a vast geographic area, targeting various neighborhoods across Los Angeles and eventually extending into San Francisco. His victims were of different ages, ethnicities, and genders, and he used a wide array of weapons and methods. This lack of a consistent pattern made it difficult for investigators to link the crimes initially. Moreover, Ramirez's tendency to attack at night further complicated efforts to catch him in the act. As the attacks escalated, the Los Angeles Police Department, LAPD, recognized the need for a coordinated effort. A special task force was formed, comprising detectives from various divisions, including the homicide, robbery, and sex crimes units. They worked closely with the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department and other local law enforcement agencies to pool resources and share information. Despite the challenges, several key pieces of forensic evidence began to emerge. Investigators discovered a distinctive Avia sneaker print at multiple crime scenes. This rare shoe became a crucial piece of evidence, linking various attacks. Ballistic analysis revealed that the same .22 caliber handgun was used in several murders, providing further connections between the cases. Although Ramirez often wore gloves, he occasionally left partial fingerprints. One such print was recovered from a window screen removed at a crime scene. Survivor accounts and witness testimonies also played a critical role. Victims who survived Ramirez's attacks provided descriptions of their assailant, noting his gaunt appearance, rotting teeth, and intense eyes. Composite sketches based on these descriptions were circulated, but without a name or solid lead, progress was slow. On August 24, 1985, Ramirez broke into the home of Bill Carnes and his fiancée, Inez Erickson. After shooting Carnes in the head and sexually assaulting Erickson, Ramirez fled. Erickson, despite her trauma, provided a detailed description of Ramirez and his car. Investigators found a fingerprint in the stolen car Ramirez abandoned, which matched fingerprints from previous crime scenes. The identification, the fingerprint match, finally gave investigators a name: Richard Ramirez. He had a prior criminal record for petty crimes, including auto theft, which had put his prints in the system. Public identification. Law enforcement decided to release Ramirez's name and photograph to the public, hoping that someone might recognize him and provide information leading to his capture. This decision proved to be pivotal. The Night Stalker case generated an unprecedented level of media attention and public fear. The randomness and brutality of the crimes, coupled with the satanic elements, created a sense of widespread panic and outrage. The media quickly latched onto the Night Stalker moniker, and the case dominated headlines. Graphic details of the attacks, descriptions of Ramirez's appearance, and his satanic affiliations were splashed across newspapers, TV news reports, and radio broadcasts. The constant media coverage kept the public on edge, with daily updates on the investigation and new crimes. The fear instilled by Ramirez's crimes was palpable. Residents of Los Angeles and surrounding areas took drastic measures to protect themselves. Sales of guns, locks, and security systems soared as people tried to safeguard their homes. Community meetings were held, and neighborhood watch groups were formed to increase vigilance. Parents kept their children indoors, and many people avoided going out after dark. The satanic symbols left at crime scenes fueled rumors and conspiracy theories, adding to the sense of dread. The idea that such a remorseless and sadistic killer could strike anywhere, at any time, left the community feeling vulnerable and helpless. The release of Ramirez's name and photograph marked a turning point. On August 30th, 1985, a group of residents in East Los Angeles recognized Ramirez from the media coverage. He was spotted attempting to carjack a woman after realizing he had been identified. The residents pursued Ramirez, capturing him and detaining him until police arrived. The public's role in Ramirez's capture underscored the sense of collective relief and triumph over the terror that had gripped Southern California. The community's vigilance and quick action demonstrated their resilience and determination to end the Night Stalker's reign of terror. Ramirez's arrest brought an end to his horrifying crime spree, but the impact of his actions lingered. The media continued to cover the story extensively, detailing the legal proceedings and delving into Ramirez's background and psychological profile. The trial, which began in 1988, was a media spectacle, drawing attention from across the nation. The trial saw dramatic moments, including emotional testimonies from survivors and the families of victims. The prosecution presented a wealth of evidence, including detailed forensic analysis, witness statements, and items recovered from Ramirez's belongings. Public interest was at an all-time high, with people lining up outside the courthouse for a chance to witness the proceedings. The media coverage was relentless, with nightly news segments dissecting each day's events in the courtroom. Despite the overwhelming evidence, Ramirez remained defiant, often smirking and taunting the victims' families. His behavior only added to the public's fascination and horror. Ramirez was convicted of 13 counts of murder, 5 counts of attempted murder, 11 counts of sexual assault, and 14 counts of burglary. He was sentenced to death and remained on death row until his death in 2013. The Night Stalker case remains one of the most notorious and chilling chapters in the history of American crime. The investigation highlighted the challenges of tracking a highly unpredictable and sadistic killer, while the community's response demonstrated the power of collective action in the face of fear and violence. The capture of Richard Ramirez was the culmination of intense investigative efforts and public vigilance. Following the release of his name and photograph, it was only a matter of time before Ramirez's luck ran out. On August 30th, 1985, Ramirez was returning to Los Angeles from a visit to his brother in Tucson, Arizona. Unaware that his face had been plastered across media outlets, he entered a liquor store in East Los Angeles. Inside, he noticed a group of elderly Mexican women pointing at him and calling him El Matador, the killer. Realizing he had been recognized, Ramirez fled the store in a panic. As he ran, Ramirez attempted to carjack several vehicles, but his erratic behavior drew the attention of nearby residents. At one point, he pulled a woman from her car, but was chased away by her husband. The neighborhood quickly mobilized against him. Ramirez ran through the streets, jumping fences and trying to evade capture, but was eventually cornered by a group of citizens in the Boyle Heights area. One of the key individuals in his capture was 56-year-old Manuel de la Torre, who recognized Ramirez from the news reports. He alerted others in the neighborhood, and a group of men chased Ramirez down Hubbard Street. The chase was chaotic, with Ramirez trying desperately to escape. Eventually, de la Torre and others subdued him, beating him and holding him until police arrived. When the LAPD arrived, they found Ramirez beaten and bloodied, restrained by the community members. The officers took him into custody, and as they did, Ramirez reportedly looked up and said, "Thank God you got me." His capture marked the end of a terrorizing spree that had left Southern California in fear. The trial of Richard Ramirez was one of the most sensational and closely followed in American history. It began on January 29, 1989, nearly 3.5 years after his arrest. The proceedings were marked by high drama, bizarre behavior from the defendant, and emotional testimonies from survivors and witnesses. From the outset, Ramirez displayed erratic and defiant behavior. He often disrupted the proceedings with outbursts and gestures. On the first day of the trial, he raised his hand to reveal a pentagram drawn on his palm, shouting, "Hail Satan." His demeanor in court was a blend of arrogance and disinterest as he smirked, laughed, and taunted the gallery and the jury. The prosecution, led by Los Angeles Deputy District Attorney Phil Halpin, presented a mountain of evidence against Ramirez. This included the distinctive Avia sneaker prints, fingerprints, and ballistic evidence linking Ramirez to multiple crime scenes. Survivors of Ramirez's attacks provided powerful and harrowing accounts of their experiences. Their testimonies were crucial in establishing the brutality and randomness of his crimes. One particularly compelling witness was 16-year-old Anastasia Hronis, who had been abducted and raped by Ramirez, but survived to identify him in court. Items stolen from victims' homes were found in Ramirez's possession, including jewelry and other personal belongings. The pentagrams and satanic symbols he left at the crime scenes were also highlighted as part of his modus operandi. Ramirez's prior criminal activities, including arrests for car theft and drug possession, were used to demonstrate a pattern of escalating violence. The defense, led by attorney Arturo Hernandez, attempted to argue that Ramirez was a victim of mistaken identity. They claimed that the evidence was circumstantial and that the witnesses were unreliable. However, the overwhelming forensic evidence, coupled with the eyewitness testimonies, made it difficult for the defense to create reasonable doubt. After a lengthy trial that lasted for several months, the jury deliberated for 22 days. On September 20th, 1989, Richard Ramirez was found guilty on 43 charges, including 13 counts of murder, 5 counts of attempted murder, 11 counts of sexual assault, and 14 counts of burglary. The jury's decision was a resounding affirmation of the prosecution's case. The sentencing phase of the trial began on October 3, 1989. The prosecution sought the death penalty, arguing that Ramirez's crimes were particularly heinous and showed a complete disregard for human life. They emphasized the brutality of his attacks, the suffering of the victims, and the terror inflicted on the community. Family members of the victims and survivors gave emotional impact statements describing the devastating effects of Ramirez's crimes on their lives. Their testimonies underscored the profound loss and trauma caused by his actions. Throughout the sentencing phase, Ramirez maintained his defiant attitude. When given the opportunity to speak, he remained unapologetic and unrepentant. He famously declared, "Big deal. Death always went with the territory. See you in Disneyland." On November 7, 1989, the jury returned a unanimous recommendation for the death penalty. Judge Michael Tynan formally sentenced Richard Ramirez to death in California's gas chamber. In delivering the sentence, Judge Tynan described Ramirez's actions as cruel, predatory, and unspeakable. Ramirez was transferred to San Quentin State Prison, where he would remain on death row until his death from complications related to B-cell lymphoma on June 7, 2013. He never expressed remorse for his crimes, and his notoriety continued to fascinate and horrify the public until his death. The capture and trial of Richard Ramirez brought a sense of closure to the victims' families and the communities terrorized by his actions. His conviction and sentencing underscored the efforts of law enforcement and the resilience of a community that banded together to bring a sadistic killer to justice. The crimes of Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker, left an indelible mark on society, profoundly affecting the victims' families, the communities of Southern California, and the broader public consciousness. The families of Ramirez's victims were left to cope with unimaginable grief and loss. Many struggled with the psychological trauma of losing loved ones in such brutal and senseless ways. The testimonies given during the trial highlighted the deep scars left by Ramirez's actions, and for many families, the pain endured long after the trial ended. Despite the conviction, some family members found little solace in Ramirez's death sentence, as the emotional and psychological wounds ran deep. The fear instilled by Ramirez's crime spree reshaped the way communities in Southern California viewed safety and security. Neighborhoods that once felt safe were plunged into fear and suspicion. People installed new locks, security systems, and formed neighborhood watch groups. The sense of vulnerability that Ramirez created lasted long after his arrest, changing the community's approach to personal and home security permanently. Ramirez's reign of terror also led to significant changes in law enforcement practices. The Los Angeles Police Department and other agencies involved in the case adopted more sophisticated forensic techniques and improved interagency communication to better handle similar cases in the future. The case also sparked a national conversation about the importance of mental health support and early intervention for at-risk youth. Richard Ramirez's legacy is a chilling reminder of the depths of human depravity and the importance of vigilance and community support in the face of such evil. The case drew attention to the importance of addressing mental health issues and the potential consequences of untreated psychological trauma and abuse, both of which played roles in Ramirez's development as a serial killer. The Night Stalker case underscored the need for improved forensic techniques and interagency cooperation in solving crimes. The use of forensic evidence, such as shoe prints, fingerprints, and ballistics, in linking Ramirez to his crimes demonstrated the importance of these tools in modern criminal investigations. The intense media coverage of the Night Stalker case illustrated both the power and the potential pitfalls of media involvement in criminal cases. While the media played a crucial role in disseminating Ramirez's image, leading to his capture, it also contributed to widespread panic and sensationalism that sometimes overshadowed the experiences of the victims. After his sentencing, Richard Ramirez was transferred to San Quentin State Prison, where he spent the remainder of his life on death row. His time in prison was marked by continued notoriety and bizarre behavior. Ramirez maintained his allegiance to Satanism, often making references to the devil and continuing to display a lack of remorse for his crimes. Despite his heinous acts, Ramirez garnered a macabre following. He received fan mail from admirers, some of whom viewed him as a dark, rebellious figure. This phenomenon is not uncommon among notorious criminals, but in Ramirez's case it was particularly disturbing given the brutality of his crimes. He also married one of his admirers, Doreen Lioe, in 1996, further highlighting the strange fascination some people had with him. Ramirez's health began to decline in the years following his conviction. He was diagnosed with B-cell lymphoma and also suffered from complications related to chronic substance abuse and hepatitis C. On June 7, 2013, Richard Ramirez died from complications of B-cell lymphoma at Marin General Hospital in Green Bay, California. At the time of his death, he had spent nearly 24 years on death row. Now it's time to slowly drift into sleep. Close your eyes, let go, and allow sleep to gently carry you away into a night of sweet dreams and restful slumber.